All right, so today is Ask the Pastor. All right, and so we've been advertising this over the past couple of weeks and inviting you to send in your questions. And there have been a number of questions that I've received, some of which I'm not going to be able to kind of get into. Maybe we'll see how the time goes. Looks like we're doing pretty good with time. And maybe even field some questions live this morning. But as we get started, I just want to say a few things about questions. First of all, not all questions are equal. So we have a slide here for that. Not all questions are equal. Some questions are more complicated than other questions. Some questions are just very simple questions. Like some have very simple answers to them. For example, maybe you walked in this morning and you see people with some coffee, and maybe your question was just simply, how do I get a cup of coffee? And the answer to that is pretty simple. You stop out at the coffee bar and somebody will serve you and give you a cup of coffee. Or maybe you were wondering about students and you heard last week on Tuesday they had their student kickoff, and you just simply asked the question, so what happened in Explosion on Tuesday night? And the answer to that would be a pretty simple answer if you knew a leader who was there and they could just kind of explain what happened. Some questions are simple like that, right? It's just really simple. We don't think too much about them. They don't involve too much in-depth thought even after we get the answer. It's just really clear and simple. But then there are other questions that require multiple layers of answers in order to get to the answer. And as I was thinking about that this past week, I was thinking about math and how there's a number of students who've gone back to school, right? College students are back in college. And when you think about math, and in particular higher levels of math, calculus, and so here's an algebra problem. But, you think about an algebra problem, and some of us look at this equation, or the very first line is just the simple problem that is, we need to find the answer. What is the answer to x, right? And some of us look at 5 with the parenthesis 3x plus 2 and wonder what's in the parenthesis and why is it in the parenthesis and how do you even solve the 5, whatever, and that, and then the minus. It's like, you look at it, it's all confusing. It's even a confusing question. And why is there x with numbers? That doesn't make any sense. Numbers go with numbers and letters go with letters. But now math puts numbers and letters together, right? And the question is so complex that some of us, it's like, I just can't even get beyond the question. But then we start into it, and you begin to solve it, and you solve it piece by piece, step by step, and there's certain bit of information that you have to know. You have to know to solve this problem, basic addition, subtraction, but also multiplication, and how all of that works. And then you need to know something about positive numbers and negative numbers, and how to subtract and where all that goes. And slowly you work your way through the equation, and it takes multiple steps to get to an answer. Now sometimes the answer isn't one that's even understandable. So I don't understand anything about calculus or Calc 2, but I have a student, a son who's in college right now, and he's taking this calculus stuff, and he talks to me about numbers, like solving problems with infinity. Like, how do you do that? Like, infinity is below my mind. Like, I can't even understand infinity, right? Infinity is forever, goes on and 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 never stops. And yet you're solving a problem with the answer. You're coming to an answer with it, and it doesn't make any sense, right? And the same is true about questions in life, and sometimes questions that we ask, biblical questions. They're just so complex that when we come to an answer, we can't even be certain that we have the answer, can understand the answer, into the depth that it goes, because it's just beyond us. So not all questions are equal. And I think it's important for us to start there. Secondly, all answers to questions, when you think about it, require logic and faith. Whenever you have a question, for you to come to an understanding about that, it requires a bit of information. So that's what I mean by logic. So the next slide will have that for us, right? can you go to the next slide? There we go. All answers require logic and faith. And then not all questions have understandable answers. Some of them, back to that mathematical equation problem, we can't get to the bottom of it. And then the last thing I want to say about questions is that questions aren't bad. It's not bad to ask these questions. Just because you have a question, you have a question. It may go back up to the reality that we need to have some information and think our way through whatever it is because we don't understand it. So that's where the logic comes in. That's where the information fits in there. But then ultimately we have faith, and we have to live life by faith, and we trust and we move forward in life. So having a question isn't a bad thing. And it can be a question about something that maybe it's a question that you feel like you're not supposed to answer or not supposed to ask because you're supposed to just accept the answer, which doesn't really make sense to you, has been the answer. So you feel like to ask that question, in particular about spiritual things, is something you're not supposed to do. And I would just discourage that and say no. Throughout Scripture, we find people asking questions. We find people asking hard questions of God. It's totally appropriate to ask questions. All right, so with all that, just kind of as laying the groundwork on why we would do such a Sunday, is to ask a question. I'm going to start with one question that somebody had sent in, and it was, the question, go to the next slide. The question is simply this: did Satan start the fire in the garage, or was it an accident? All right, and so what you see here is my vehicle. My vehicle is the white van there, which is no longer, it is gone. And so on July the 7th, the message was in the series on the dark realm in which we were talking about how there is a realm that we cannot see, a spiritual realm that we do not see, do not understand. It's a spiritual realm, and yet in that realm things happen. And in that realm there's somebody who's powerful who does stuff. So what had happened with my van was our boys had taken our van down to North Carolina, visiting some friends, former neighbors, and while they were there, the van caught on fire, and the question was, well, how did the van catch on fire? And as I shared the story, I simply ended by saying this, by asking a question. I said to you, what would you think if I said to you that the van, or that the fire, the garage fire, was a result of a work of the dark realm? What would you say? Would you think I'm crazy? Would you think I'm insane, right? And so as we worked our way through that message, the message came from Job chapter 1 and 2, a story in which Satan, dark forces of evil, appears in front of God and asks or says to God, if you do some pretty hard things to Job, he'll turn against you. And God said, okay, go for it. And so Satan went out and he brought all kinds of destruction upon Job's life. He encouraged the movement of enemies that came in and stole a bunch of stuff, sent fire down from heaven, burned up stuff, caused huge winds to come, knock down the building in which his children were in, and they were all killed. And from the story of Job 1 and 2, what we learned is that there's a powerful, evil, spiritual person who is destructive, cruel, and heartless, and can supernaturally affect the material world. So, is it possible that Satan caused the fire in the garage? Or was the fire just simply an accident? That's the question, right? Well, to begin to answer that question, this is like one of those, like an algebra question or a calculus question, and it's a big question, and some of us are like, it's a question too big for me, and then others are like, okay, let's start into it. So as you start into it, one of the things that we have to accept or understand or begin with is that there is a dark force throughout Scripture. Now, if you don't believe in the Bible, then I would direct you to another series that we did, a 4-week series that we did Fake news was the title of it. And we did that back in 2022. It'd be available online for you to kind of go back and look at that. It's like, why do you believe that the Bible really is authoritative? But we hold that position here at Hope Community Church. We believe that the Bible is of God, from God, given to us, and instructs us, informs us about the world, including life and how we should live in it. And one of the things that you see repeatedly throughout Scripture is this reality. There's a powerful, evil, spiritual person who's destructive, cruel, heartless, and set on your destruction. In particular, your spiritual, who you are immaterially. He wants to keep you away from God. Job, clearly, we see that in the story. Secondly, as we begin to answer this question, we see that we can see what happens in the material world and then make a material-based conclusion. All right, what I mean by that is we as people have eyes to see where we live, right? I mean, our eyes, our ears, all the senses that we have enable us to interact with the material world, that which is physical, that we can, right, touch, feel, hear, smell, right? But the spiritual world is intangible, can't be touched. You have a spirit to you, and nobody can get in there and touch it. You can't even touch it. It's kind of, it's and then it's invisible. It can't be seen. So you're spiritual, and yet we also see in Scripture that God is spirit, that He made spirit beings, angels, that some of those spirit beings fell, turned against God. There's Satan led the path, and demons. And we can only see what happens here in the material world and not what is happening in the spiritual world. So if we can't see what's happening in the spiritual world and only can see what's happening in the material world, then it becomes really difficult for us to have an absolute solid answer to the question, did Satan, a spiritual being, caused a material action to happen, fire in a garage that consumes my van? It's hard. I can't answer that question. You can't answer that question. And what's interesting is when you read the book of Job, Job didn't have the answer to the question either. Because Job, all he could see was the material world. He could see the effects in the material world. He could see how it affected him personally. And therefore come to conclusions based upon what's taking place in the material world. And could come to the conclusion, as the insurance company came to a conclusion, that what started the fire in the garage was batteries in a golf cart that were being charged that exploded. And that's the conclusion of the fire investigator who came and investigated it and looked at the garage, and he concluded that's what happened. Now, many of us would say that's an accident. Right? It's something that happened. And we probably can scientifically look at what happened when electricity was being connected to battery terminals and whatever was taking place between that electricity and the acids in the battery terminals, which then cause a fire to be ignited. Very scientific. It's very material. It's all material, so we can see it, we can talk about it. And that's what happened, right? Materially. But the question still exists. Can spiritual forces cause these things to happen? And again, I go back and I just simply say, I don't have the answer. I don't have the full answer to that. I can't see into the spiritual world. We can't see into the spiritual world, thus we cannot make a spiritual conclusion. Conclusion is the key word. We can't have 2 + 2 = 4 kind of conclusion. Now, why is this an important question? If we can't know what's taking place in the spiritual world, why do we even bother asking the question? Why do we even run down this pathway and, start down trying to solve it? Well, I'll just offer I'll offer this. Number one, I think it's important and helpful for us to consider that there is a spiritual world that is dead set against us and our spirit following after God. And so we find in Scripture a couple places like Ephesians chapter 6, where we began the Dark Realms series, where we learn that we don't fight battles in this world. We don't wage a war in this world, the material world, with physical weapons, but with spiritual weapons. Or as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, we don't use the weapons of the world, material things, to deal with spiritual things, but instead we demolish strongholds that set itself up against Christ by taking our thoughts captive and making them obedient to him. Ephesians 6, it's all about put on the armor of God. Prepare your feet, put on the belt of truth, wear a breastplate of righteousness, put on the helmet of salvation, take the sword of the Spirit, all which is material words, right? Feet, belt, breastplate, helmet, these are all a visual of material things, but they all speak to spiritual. So Satan, who is immaterial, spiritual, has an impact in the material world, but we as people fight him not with material weapons, but with spiritual weapons. And that's how we have to live our life. Recognizing that Satan wants more than anything, however he may be affecting us materially, is all about getting us spiritually. So as you study Job, what you see Satan doing when he comes to God is say, if you get him physically, if you get him in the material world, he'll turn against you, spiritual world. And that's where Satan always wants to go. So again, math problem, work your way through it. We come to the end of it without a clear, understandable answer to the question, and yet with some sense of understanding of what the conclusion is. Make sense? Clear, but fuzzy, right? And so we have to hold on to it mysteriously, as a mystery. All right, second question. Somebody asked, was this, they said, back in the Hard Sayings of Jesus series, one of the last messages was from Mark chapter 11, verse 20 through 33. And in that message, we looked at Jesus cursing a fig tree. And so the person asks this question. So Jesus was hungry. He goes to a fig tree to eat. Unfortunately, it was not the season for figs. But Jesus said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And then they write, that sounds harsh. It sounds like Jesus was irritable, stubborn, maybe rude. So then they write this question: why would Jesus curse a fig tree? Do you feel as though this act of negative behavior is unlike Jesus? Even if it is unlike Jesus, does that mean that he didn't need to act out that way? Why would Jesus curse a fig tree? And when you think about it, it does seem kind of crazy. Why does somebody walk up to a tree, a harmless little tree, and just say something to it to kill it? And Jesus has the power, because he has the power to miraculously do that. Doesn't that seem like he's unkind, he's harsh? Isn't there another way to do this? Like, why just take the life of a fig tree? So that's the question. It really gets into a question of Jesus' character, a question of what kind of person is he. As I've thought about this, one of the first thoughts I had about it is, it does seem right, like Jesus is pretty rough on the tree. But then I thought about me, and I thought about my interactions with trees recently. There are a couple trees in my backyard that the tops of them were dead, and so I got a chainsaw. I had a friend come on over, and we cut down a couple of them. Why? Why did we cut down the tree? I mean, the tree was alive, but it was definitely dying. It was an ash, beetle ash have gone through the state, right? It's killing all ash trees everywhere. We got these chainsaws out. We took down 3 trees. Why did we take down the 3 trees? Were we being harsh to cut down the trees? Were we being mean to the trees to cut down the trees? Well, I took the trees down because I don't want the trees falling on me. I don't want the trees falling on my house. I don't want the trees falling on people, right? You cut the trees down to make it safer, right? So is it wrong to cut down a tree to do that? Is it harsh? Is it harsh? Was I being mean to do that? Now, there's a few people in society who probably would say, yes, that was harsh, that was wrong, that was a bad thing to do. You took the life of a tree, all right? But that's a very small slice. Most people would say, if a tree is going to cause danger to other people, it needs to be taken down. Or if you're going to build a home, it's okay to cut down trees. It's not a harsh thing to cut down trees to remove those trees. Especially, it's not bad if you're going to use them. If you're going to cut them up and you're going to turn them into lumber and you're going to use them to look at the beautiful wood around the, in the building here, the beautiful wood and the rafters. So we say, okay, that wasn't a harsh thing because you had a good purpose for it. You had a good purpose for it. You're going to take down the tree to protect people. You're going to take out a tree to make something out of it. So that's not being harsh. But Jesus, we think Jesus is being harsh because he speaks to a tree pointlessly. Well, the reality is that Jesus doesn't speak to the tree pointlessly. He speaks to the tree with great intent and with a purpose. His purpose is to teach. His purpose is to demonstrate something very important. And so he takes the life of a tree to teach something important. We take the life of a tree to make something. So what happens in the story? So really quickly, the structure of the story is that Jesus encounters a fig tree. He curses it. Next, he goes into the temple area in the city of Jerusalem. He sees what's going on, buying, selling of animals and the exchange of money for them, and then he chases out the money changers, and then after that says that my house is to be a house of prayer, and then he leaves, and it's the next day that we encounter this fig tree. So it's fig tree cursing of the behavior of the people who are attempting to earn favor with God by offering a sacrifice, an animal. They have to buy the animal to offer it. So there's this exchange of money. There's this sense in which people are doing things in order to make God happy. They're trying to be good enough in order to get God to be good to them. They're following some religious system, some structure. This is what's going on. Jesus goes in. He confronts that. Goes away, finds the tree. So that's the fig tree, confrontation, fig tree. That's the structure of the story. Now, what's really happening is that Jesus' cursing of the fig tree is a parable. It's a story to point out that reality. And so I write it like this, and here on the side screens you can see it. Jesus is not acting out in anger toward an innocent tree, but instead he's acting out a parable meant to teach a deeper meaning of cleansing the temple. Jesus' words to the fig tree apply to the nation of Israel. Cursed is Israel, for she is fruitful in appearance, but barren spiritually. The fig tree, his cursing of the fig tree, is a story. It's a parable. He does this to illustrate how the nation of Israel, his chosen people, have turned against God and are attempting to connect to God in wrong ways. And so he's confronting that. And that's what's going on in this parable. So could he have done it another way? Sure, he could have done it another way. But is he harsh to the tree because he uses the tree as the parable? Are you harsh to a tree because you choose to make a piece of furniture so that you have a chair to sit on, which you're sitting on right now? No. No, you're using it for a purpose, and Jesus was using it for a purpose. I don't think Jesus was being unkind to a tree. I don't think Jesus has a disregard for creation. In fact, we know that Jesus, as God in flesh, tells us that it's our responsibility as people to shepherd and care for the garden in which he put the people in. And it is our responsibility to wisely steward his creation. Jesus wisely would steward his creation, not just harshly use it and abuse it for his own purposes. Third question that was asked. And that question wasn't related to the series at all, but it is a question that I do hear, especially among people who are followers of Jesus and already connected to the church. And so the third question, next slide will show us what that is. It's how does predestination, that word means God predetermines things. So God, sometime way back in the past, because there's no beginning or end to God, so this is infinity, this is our inability to understand God, but God always has existed and always will exist. So how does God, who always existed, looking out into the future, seeing a point in time, which is our language, point in time, because for him there's no such thing as point in time, because he's eternally existent, but out into a point in time in our language, creates a world, and in it he creates people, and in it he predetermines events to take place. So the question is, how does predestination, how is God predetermining and then electing, that is the process by which God chooses people to become his people, how does God looking into the future, picking people, and free will or choice fit together? So this is a big, complicated question, right? I mean, this is definitely back to that algebra, calculus kind of thing. It's like, there's many, many steps that you need to walk through in order to come to an answer for this question. I would say, really, to get to an answer to this question, that the 5 or 10 minutes that I'm going to spend does complete injustice to it. It probably requires anywhere between, 50 and 100 hours of reading different passages of Scripture and wrestling with the question. It takes a long time to work your way through to come to a very satisfying answer. I'm going to do it in 10 minutes, and it won't be satisfying. So here we go. Here's how I'm going to attempt to answer it. First of all, just kind of direct us to Scripture where we see this tension in which you see God doing something, God predetermining certain events, and then yet you see people doing something. And so it's God and people. It's like, how do those two come together? So a great place to see this is in the story of God's interaction with Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. And what you find in the book of Exodus, right, is this story of God saying to Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I want you to confront Pharaoh to let my people go out of the nation of Egypt and to come into the promised land of Israel. And God, 400 years prior, had promised to Abraham that he was going to turn him into a great nation. So at this point in time, that promise has been fulfilled. 400 years into the future, it's fulfilled. They're a great nation. They're going to come out. Now, Egypt at this time is being led by a Pharaoh who has turned against the nation of Israel. And he has enslaved the people of Israel. And so God sends Moses to the Pharaoh to say, let my people go. What's interesting in the story is that we find this phrase in which it's Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh has a hard heart. Now, you probably can understand what a hard heart is. You may have interacted with people who have had a hard heart. You may have had a hard heart. You may have a hard heart. So a hard heart is simply this. It's a heart that's closed off, that will not receive. If you think of something that's hard, right? This table, it's hard, and we pour water on it, the table will not receive water. It's not open, it's not porous to be able to receive the water into it. The same thing happens to us in our hearts. Our hearts can be hardened to spiritual truths, hardened to the reality that are, like the analogy earlier that I used of life can be like a car and it can get dirty. We can sometimes be hardened, have blind eyes to the reality of the layer of dust that has collected on the dashboard. We use the car, we're in and out, we don't pay attention to it, we don't see it. So our eyes have become hardened. Our hearts can be hardened against God. What we see in this story, as you see in the side screens, is that Pharaoh's heart has been hardened. 5 times in the text, we just see Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And this is exact the language that comes right from the text. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Now, what we don't know as you're reading that is what hardened Pharaoh's heart. Why is his heart hardened? It's just simply a statement in the story that Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And so he won't let the people go. God does a plague. Pharaoh's heart's hardened. He won't respond to the hail that wrecks his crops, or he doesn't want to respond to the water that's turned into blood, or the fact that there's frogs hopping around, or that there's boils that go across, on and on the 10 plagues, right? What you see is that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. But then we do get a glimpse into why his heart is hardened. So 3 times in the text we see this exact phrase. Pharaoh hardened his heart. There's a responsibility. There's something that Pharaoh does. There's a response in Pharaoh that he has. There's a decision that Pharaoh is making. There's a choice that he is making. And because of that, his heart is hardened and gets harder and harder. But then we run into this 6 times, this phrase, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now, wait a minute. Now, who hardened whose heart here? Isn't this begin to get confusing? In the beginning, we say we don't know why Pharaoh's heart's hardened. The text just says his heart's hardened. Then it's Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then it's God hardens his heart. Which is it? This is where it gets difficult and complex to try to unravel this question. It leads us to say things like, if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, then Pharaoh's having no choice. God is doing it. And this is then this leads to this thought about God. God obviously must be a bad guy. I mean, he's bringing bad things upon somebody. So now we don't like God, because God looks out into the future. He chooses, predetermines, he elects certain things. God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. What choice does Pharaoh have in the matter? How can Pharaoh do anything, right? And so this creates this angst with us about God. God must be a bad guy. Well, is that true? I mean, that's a natural response that people have. But is that really true? That God is bad? So you have to kind of keep digging, and you have to keep digging into what does it mean that God is doing these things? What's the reason for him doing these things? What kinds of outcomes do we see when he does these kinds of things? Another great passage wrestling with this would be Romans chapter 10, in which we read in Romans 10, Paul talking to the church of Rome and saying, hey, God has chosen Jacob, but Esau, he hasn't. And you go back in Genesis and you even read the story and you see that God tells Abraham and Sarah ahead of time that the younger son is going to rule over the older. The older is going to be ruled by the younger. Jacob, before Jacob and Esau are even born, before they even do anything. And as Paul wrestles through that in Romans chapter 10, he brings up this question that people are asking, like, God is doing this. How does this work out? It seems like God is unjust. It seems like God isn't nice. Paul pulls that thread in the Romans 10 text. So you have to study it. You have to read it. You have to think about it. But then you can't just stay there. You have to keep going. So I had back in 1992, I wrote a paper about this tension. And I don't remember. There's got to be 100 passages of Scripture that I read through and trying to unravel this. And that's some of what I mean when I say that you have to read and study and research and read and study and research and read and study and research, because you look at this passage and it gives you a certain nuance, and you look at that passage and it gives you another nuance, and then you look at this passage and it adds this slight bit of little bit of a different angle to look at it, and this one over here adds that, and it begins to be like a diamond ring that is so multifaceted. You look at it and you say that's a diamond ring, but it has all these cuts and these angles to it. It's just, its beauty is in its complexity, but it's incredibly complex. And so, some of the conclusions that you come to when you study Scripture is this: number one, that God is sovereign over everything, and He predetermines events. This is a reality of Scripture. You begin in Genesis and you see that in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God. That's the first thing you see. In the beginning, God. God is over everything. That's what the word sovereign means. He reigns and rules over everything. And because He rules and reigns over everything, He created everything. He knows how everything is going to work together. He can predetermine events. Second thing, Scripture is really clear about this. People have a choice and are responsible with their choice. So like, again, go back to Genesis chapter 2, Genesis 1, in the beginning God creates, get to the end, He creates man and woman in His image. You go to chapter 2, and chapter 2, God says to the man, hey, I'm putting you in the garden, and you are free. You have a choice. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden except for one. God gives them a choice. You have a choice. You can choose to eat from that tree, or you can choose to be obedient and not eat from that tree. And then the rest of Scripture, you just study. People have choices and are responsible for their choice. And so we see that Pharaoh is responsible for his choice. And he ultimately is judged. He loses the nation of Israel. They are set out and set free from him and his work. And so what we end up with is that we have these two truths. And to many of us, if you look at it, it seems like a contradiction. But in fact, it's not a contradiction, but it's a paradox. A contradiction means there are two opposing things that make it not true. Right? Two things are happening, so it makes something not true. A paradox just simply is there's these two things that seem like they're not true and they're not understandable because of it. And so kind of to illustrate that, I brought along this rope. All right? This rope is been through a lot. It's got knots all in it. My kids have climbed trees with it, have drug things, have pulled each other around the neighborhood on bikes and all kinds of things. But I bring this rope along to just kind of illustrate, the knots got me stuck there, which is going to wreck my illustration. So if you think of this side of the rope bearing the weight of God being sovereign, God predetermines everything in life. And if everything is based on that question and you just hold only onto that truth, and I really brought the wrong rope because it won't go over, right? And if I just keep pulling on this side, eventually what's going to happen is the rope's going to fall, right? Well, then the other side of the equation is that man has ability to choose, and they have a responsibility. And if all I'm going to do is pull on this, then I'm diminishing who God is. And here's what I really want us to see is this is just one rope, right? It's just one big, long piece of rope with a knot that keeps getting stuck, and I should have brought a different piece of rope. But it gets at the point, right, that these two things, they're all it's one big thing. It's connected. It's wound together, and it's something that's impossible for us to fully undo and understand, and yet they are one thing. And so it's a mystery. It is God who understands the answer to the question that we ask. But it's not a contradiction. It's just simply a paradox and our inability with our little minds, because they are finite minds, to be able to understand something so complex. So I'm going to invite our worship team up. I don't know if this was helpful to anybody in their questions. And there were other questions that were asked, and we're not going to get to them today. But yeah, we have questions. It's okay to ask them. It's good to ask them. Just remember that with them, there's just no simple answer sometimes. And we have to be able to just, in tension, allow things to just be mysterious, because we just don't have the ability to grasp the true answer to it. Go ahead, Rylan, lead us.
Please stand. I'm calling on the God of Jacob, whose love endures through generations. I know that you will keep your covenant. I'm calling on the God of Moses, the one who opened up the ocean. I need you now to do the same for me. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. The God of Mary, whose favor rests upon the lonely. I know with you all things are possible. I'm calling on the God of Mary, who made a shepherd born courageous. I may not face Goliath, but I've got my own giant. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. You heard your children now. You hear your children now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You answered prayers back then, and you will answer now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You were providing. You are providing now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You moved in power then. how I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. Oh, your faithfulness. I'm calling on the Holy Spirit, almighty river, come and fill me. Come and fill me up.
Hope Community Church, as you go, remember we live by faith. Everybody lives by faith. Life is lived by faith. We have questions. There's good answers, but not always the full answer. And that's where faith comes in. So be a people who live by faith. Have a great week.